Hello, my name is Patrick Deneen, and I am a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. I'll be speaking today on traditionalism and ordered liberty, and I'm delighted to be able to do this today under the auspices of the Leadership Institute. I'll be speaking today about the tradition of ordered liberty in the American tradition, but I also want to speak more broadly about this tradition as it's informed by the longer history of political philosophy in the West. But perhaps the place to start is at the time in American history, in roughly the 1950s, when the works that I'll be talking about really came into their own. And at this period of time in American history, in roughly the mid part of the 20th century, there was a widespread belief that there was no conservative tradition in America, and in fact that there never had been a conservative tradition in America. A famous quote that was drawn from a book called The Liberal Imagination by the author Lionel Trilling in 1950 runs as follows. He said that in the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition of America. For it is the plain fact that nowadays there is no conservative or reactionary ideas in general circulation. This does not mean, of course, that there is no impulse to conservatism or to reaction. Such impulses are certainly strong, perhaps even stronger than most of us know. But the conservative impulse and the reactionary impulse do not, with some isolated and ecclesiastical exceptions, express themselves in ideas, but only in action or in irritable mental gestures which seem to resemble ideas. What Lionel Trilling was saying then was that in America, in the mid part of the 20th century, so after the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that there was no conservative tradition, and certainly none that could be said to be an intellectual tradition. But it was during these very years that there was an outburst of intellectual activity that put to lie and really refuted this idea that liberalism was the only philosophical or worldview in America, and that there was in fact no presence of an intellectual tradition of conservatism. So in our session today, I want to point to and discuss at some moderate length 3 books written by 3 thinkers that definitively changed this landscape and launched modern conservatism, in particular in its traditionalist form. One of these books, written by Richard Weaver, called Ideas Have Consequences, was written in 1947. The second book, The Conservative Mind, was written by Russell Kirk in 1953. And the third of these books, also written in 1953, was called The Quest for Community by Robert Nisbet. But before I turn to a discussion of these books and their ideas and the content in ways that they influenced the modern conservative tradition, I'd like to first to discuss several other books or ideas that are arguably in some ways their predecessors, the tradition from which they drew and which they revived in the American setting in the middle part of the 20th century. And to suggest that not only do these books then constitute an American tradition, but they draw from a longer tradition, a tradition that has its deepest roots in the Western tradition. And in some ways you could say that it is a very conservative impulse to recognize that this conservative tradition is a very long tradition, that it has a very long set of roots that reach back far into history. The 4 authors that I want to briefly touch on before I discuss these American authors are Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, who together stand as the major figures who articulate a philosophy of natural law and a belief in the objective existence of the standard of good, of the human good, which connects ultimately from its source to the divine good. The second of these authors is Edmond Burke, whose reflections concerning the revolution in France remains the most powerful critique ever written of the central importance of tradition and of the vicious tendency of ideology in politics to be a cruel and indeed horrific manifestation of the human effort to perfect our condition, even at the cost of creating great human misery. And third, the author Alexis de Tocqueville, whose book Democracy in America remains the most penetrating diagnosis of the twin pathologies of individualism and of statism that he predicted would become self-reinforcing in modern democratic times. Aristotle was an author, a philosopher in the 4th century Athens, BC. He was the student of Plato, and along with Plato was the founder of Western philosophy. For our purposes, like Plato, Aristotle argued for the existence of a comprehensible and a knowable form of truth that could be known through human reason, and that this truth was external to human will and human choice, that human beings did not make this good, that it was, in a sense, given to us. For as Aristotle, the way that we came to know this truth would be through knowledge of human nature, what it was a human being was. For Aristotle, all human activities aim at some end, some good. And so we need to know what the final end of human activity is, what our telos is, the word telos meaning end or goal. For Aristotle, the end of human activity was the effort to attain what he called eudaimonia in the Greek, or happiness, or perhaps better, flourishing. To achieve this condition, he argued, one needed to be in the active condition of exercising virtue. And virtue in particular was the activity of the governance of our baser appetites and the effort to use reason and a kind of trained capacity of self-discipline to exercise mastery, control, or a form of self-governance. Ethics, then, for Aristotle, was the study of both what virtue is and how it can be attained. And further, politics was the study of what kind of society would best support the cultivation of virtue as widely as possible in the citizenry. In the 13th century, Aristotle's work was rediscovered, and for a time it was thought to be incompatible with the Christian tradition then regnant. But a Dominican priest named Thomas Aquinas, in the middle part of the 13th century, it is said, baptized Aristotle. He interpreted the newly discovered works of Aristotle and integrated them into Western Christianity. His landmark work, the Summa Theologiae, written in the middle part of the 13th century, was a comprehensive study of God and man with a special emphasis, again for our purposes, on the concept of natural law. Natural law was derived ultimately from the eternal law, and again the nature of the created order that God himself had set into motion. The natural law was the way in which all human beings could access and know the eternal law. All humans could know the natural law through the light of reason, and thus in this way participate in the eternal law, that is to say, the order and governance of the world. And this was accessible through human reason and through a knowledge of what it was natural law, in some senses, told us, how we could come to know the difference between good and evil. For Aquinas, this included the fact that we must preserve and care for ourselves and for our offspring, and in fact tended to line up rather well with the basic commandments that were given to us by the 10 Commandments, not to steal, not to kill. But one of the things that Aquinas gives to us is an understanding that human law must reflect the natural law in order to be legitimate. That is to say that human law is only legitimate to the extent that it reflects the natural law, and not simply the rule of the ruler, based on the will of the ruler, or mere agreement by the society. That is to say, like Aristotle, that the law is based on an external standard, something that is given that human beings don't make. Many centuries later, Edmond Burke, born in Ireland and a member of the British Parliament, would write a great text, The Reflections of the Revolution in France, criticizing the recently undertaken French Revolution. And in this great text, Edmond Burke stressed the central importance of tradition and a reverence for the inheritance of the past. Witnessing the violence and the terror, literally the terror of the French Revolution, he argued that the effort to pursue justice as it was conceived, or the effort to create a condition where human rights would be, in some ways, fully created and would fully inform human society, that this led, ironically, but perhaps predictably, to the willingness to engage in human cruelty for the sake of what was thought as of perfect justice. And Burke argued, and was deeply concerned, that what the French had done was to dispose of all of the wisdom and knowledge and guidance of the past in their belief that by wiping away everything that they had once known and all of the institutions that had once governed them, that they could in some ways remake society. And so the actions of the French Revolution, for Burke, in contrast to both the British and the American revolutions, which he regarded as in some ways preserving and maintaining those traditions, in fact, for the French, in the name of justice, ended up creating a condition of horrific injustice. And his argument was that one could not create a human society anew from simply a blueprint that was imposed on the human world. This idea, in fact, the very idea that an idea could guide human society, is the very source of the word ideology. And Edmond Burke was in many respects the first great critic of ideology. He stressed the importance of custom and tradition as necessary breaks and limits on the human propensity to act inhumanly in the name of a noble ideal. And he was, in part, critical of a then regnant theory of the social contract, the idea that simply people could contract with one another simply to make society over anew, arguing that, in fact, if society was a contract, then it was a contract not between people who were then living, but between people who were living, people who were dead, and people who were not yet born. That is to say, that a social contract had always to be concerned about its effects and its sources in a longer history. The third thinker that I think provides a valuable set of intellectual resources for the renaissance of American conservative tradition is Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century visitor to America, whose work, Democracy in America, is perhaps the greatest reflection on the nature of modern liberal democracy. This book has many valuable observations and insights, but perhaps the one we should focus on most was his insight into the dynamic that would be fostered by the embrace of equality that animated modern democratic society. This embrace of equality, to the exception of every other consideration, would have the effect of undermining and leveling all forms of distinction. Now, for Tocqueville, he recognized this would manifest itself as an hostility toward aristocracy in all of its forms, the forms of privilege that marked and defined aristocracy. But eventually, this dislike of distinction that was at the heart of a kind of egalitarian ethos would be directed at all forms of distinction, even legitimate forms of distinction, and would include, for example, distinct human cultures, family, law, religion, and even the distinction between man and God, that all of these distinctions would come under the leveling logic of egalitarianism. What Tocqueville feared then was a kind of leveled and homogeneous culture in which the only way in which human beings would understand themselves would be as individuals. They would insist that their selves were the only legitimate form of understanding the world, and that autonomy, freedom from all possible constraints, would be the only way they would achieve a kind of true liberty. Individualism, he argued, would tend to evaporate all human ties and bonds, and he wrote, would eventually throw us into the solitude of our own hearts. The irony is that, having achieved this condition of individualism, when people would inevitably need assistance in this world, they would have only one place to turn, and it would be the state. He then saw a kind of inevitable dynamic in which the ever greater egalitarianism of society would also lead to the ever-rising role of the state, what he called a kind of tutelary power, or what others have described as a kind of soft despotism. He argued instead, if democracy wanted to preserve freedom, that it needed strong local associations in order to flourish. He encouraged the arts of association, the ability of people to come together and solve their own problems, not simply to look to a distant power, as well as the maintenance of religion and the distinction between God and man in order to thwart or at least slow this dynamic of individualism and state centralization. These three great streams in the tradition of the West, the first which emphasizes that there is a truth, something we can know about human beings that allows us to understand what is good for human beings. The second, the idea that tradition and custom is the way in which we come to know that good in some ways, through the experience that's been accumulated by past generations in the form of tradition and custom. And the third, the concern of the leveling way in which modern democracy would render us into individualist units that would then come under the ever greater and encompassing power of the state, are the three streams that have informed the great tradition of an idea of traditionalism and ordered liberty.